Welcome back to my channel, and today we'll be exploring No Through Road, a collection of 4 videos found on YouTube belonging to this channel, In Drain Coal 3. No Through Road is believed to be one of the first analog horrors out there on YouTube, and at the time, many of the viewers genuinely believed this was real. What are we going to expect while watching these videos? Masked people, time loops, and death. Sounds exciting, right? I do highly recommend that you go watch the videos first, and when you're done, come back here. Now let's jump right into it, starting with the first video. In the beginning of the first video, we get shown a message that reads, on December 15th, 2008, 4 17-year-old boys from Stevenage, Hertfordshire were reported missing by their families. On December 17th, their bodies were found at Broomhall Farm, 10 miles outside of Stevenage, in the car they have been driving. The residence was thought to be long abandoned, but upon investigating, police officers found signs of recent inhabitants. The following video is unedited footage from the digital camcorder found in the car. This has been released with the family's consent in hopes for aiding the investigation. And just like the text said, we get shown the footage. The setting is inside a car driving in the night with a group of friends joking with each other. Cutting in between the footage, we briefly get shown someone playing a guitar before returning back to the car, and we get introduced to Steven, or Steve. He will be our cameraman throughout the video. The friends are enjoying a nightly drive and eventually stop when they reached an interesting destination. The camera pointed towards a sign stating, Broomhall Farm Private Road. The video glitches a bit when they say no through road. Briefly, one of the friends said that the farm was mentioned on the news but didn't go into too much detail. The friends soon briefly enter the tunnel stating how spooky it is, and one of them is worried about proceeding forward because the road is private. That and they need to return home as well. Eventually they reversed and left the private road and its tunnel, agreeing not to go back. While driving, they continue joking around and having fun, turning off and on headlights before coming across a sign, Beddington. They question where they're at, saying the area shouldn't be near where they're heading. They seem lost and are frustrated. Their phones aren't working, they've been on the road for an hour or so. They stop for a while, questioning what they should do next. Ollie, the driver, is feeling uneasy because he's responsible as the driver. And while parked, Ollie stepped out to relieve himself, as Steve found a rabbit on the road. While focusing on the rabbit, the footage cuts briefly to someone wearing a mask. They returned inside the car and chatted for a bit until Steve stepped out with the headlights on to look around the surroundings. Suddenly, Steve's happy demeanor changes to him appearing stunned as he looks off into the distance. He only snapped out of it when his friends called out to him. Steve ran back into the car and ordered Ollie to drive. The friends were confused, but Steve screamed desperately for them to drive away. The tension breaks briefly when the footage was cut to a different scene, but when we return back to the friends in the car, they're now driving off. The friends thought Steve was messing with them until he started to explain what he saw. He saw someone wearing a mask. Everyone is rightfully unsettled and just wants to return home. While driving, the road started to seem familiar, and after spotting a sign, they seem excited until they realized it was the same sign as before, Bennington. This puzzled everyone. They could have sworn they only went straight and never took any turns. How did they end up looping around and returning back to the sign? While freaking out and growing more frustrated, it briefly cuts to other footage. All smiles and laughter. Too bad when we return back to the actual footage, there's no smiles in sight, just stressed out friends. They decided to keep driving and make sure to avoid any turns. And it's been close to 3 hours while on the road, but they aren't actually sure what time it actually is because their phones aren't working. Eventually, they return back to the sign from before, only frustrating and scaring the friends more. They try turning on the radio to help distract them from the crappy situation they find themselves in, but the sounds coming out only unsettled them more. The friends soon realized the lack of cars they've been seeing on the road, and after more driving, they finally found a sign pointing them towards Stevenage. The friends rejoiced, and now cars are appearing on the road, which eased the friends' minds. They returned to cracking jokes with one another, and just to play with their friends, Ollie turns off the headlights like before, but when he turned the lights back on, they somehow ended up in front of the no-through road tunnel. The friends were silent for a second before they started freaking out. They're frustrated, and during this, the headlights went out. After it turned back on, someone appeared on the road in front of them, someone with a mask. The radio turned on, startling the friends, and the headlights kept turning on and off, the person outside slowly creeping forward as the lights returned, and eventually they reached the side window. The friends got the car to turn on and drove forward before reversing. As the person gets hit, the footage cuts briefly 2 times with more pleasant footage from the past before returning to the chaos and screaming. The audio was lost for a moment until it returned with Steven running away from the car, the sounds of his friends screaming fading away in the distance as he entered the short tunnel. The masked person went to pursue him, and for a moment, Steven thought he was actually safe until he got attacked. The camera was no longer in his possession, and we see Steven getting his head smashed in with the same camera. During his death, it cuts to clips of happier moments before we return to the final blow. In the end of the video, we get a message asking if anyone has information. That's the first video. Let's quickly recap everything. We learned that a group of teenage boys' bodies were found in December 2008 at Broomhall Farm, and a camcorder documented the events of the night they went missing. It started off normal with friends goofing around until they briefly entered the tunnel. After leaving the tunnel and its road, strange things started to happen. They found themselves unable to leave the area they're in, almost like they're looping, and had a brief encounter with someone with a mask. Eventually, they found a way out and had hope until they eventually returned back to the tunnel. The masked figure appeared and attacked all of them. This is everything we know so far. If it weren't for them constantly returning to the same locations, it would have just seemed like a murder. But there's clearly more to this. Paranormal, magical, and natural, whatever it is, it's almost like they're trapped in a space or domain, making it impossible to leave. And this masked person clearly is important. One thing that interests me though, is them being able to briefly escape before returning. Now, is the masked person causing the loops? Could be a chance. But in order to learn more, we must proceed to the next video. In the description of the second video, it states, This is the footage from the first of the 2 tapes procured by the police following the events codenamed NTR2. I can only hope they do not catch me before I obtain the second tape. Why does the person sharing the tape not want to get caught? Because apparently the footage we'll be seeing didn't have consent to be released to the public. But ignoring the potential consequences, the person is showing the footage regardless. The footage begins by showing someone driving on the road. There were 2 people and neither of them were speaking. They soon reached gates blocking the road and they had to step out of the car to continue their journey on foot. One of them was carrying flowers. They eventually reached a part of the dirt road with other flowers laying on the ground, and they set their own alongside them. Turns out James, one of the 4 friends in the first footage, miraculously survived the encounter and actually escaped the car and got away when Steven was getting, well, murdered. James escaped and was questioned at a police station. After the questioning, he struggled to speak to anyone for a while. After everything that happened, I don't blame him. Dave, his companion, was accompanying him, and eventually they returned back to the car and started driving and chatting. They even spotted a rabbit on the road. A rabbit, huh? While chatting, one topic of discussion was a Doctor Who episode, talking about how its characters time travel and whenever they meet different versions of themselves at different times. Maybe foreshadowing. Anyways, after a while, they pull over and weren't sure where they're at. They kept driving regardless and the sun was no longer in the sky. Somehow, they ended up back at the gates. James is noticeably startled and when the camera moves, we see a familiar sign. A Bennington sign. The footage suddenly started to glitch as they sit in the car, the 2 agreeing to keep driving and hope for the best. Sadly, just like what happened in the first tape, they kept coming back to the same sign. James is growing increasingly more anxious as Dave is getting frustrated. They eventually pulled over and just like before, their phones weren't working. James stepped away from the camera's view to return to the car and behind him was a masked person. This is clearly no good. And while they were sitting in the car, we can see someone briefly walking in the background. James came here just to pay his respects and now he's regretting that decision. Suddenly, they get scared by someone outside the window and guess who they found? Steve. Bloody and briefly unconscious. James took him inside the car and when he awoke, Steve was happy to see his friend still alive. But once he looked at Dave, he was confused how he got there. But he ignored that and started panicking, worried that the attacker would appear again. James tried calming him down, and he did calm down for a second until James told him that it's been 3 years. For Steve, however, it hasn't been that long since the attack. He's panicking once again and they leave the car to better comfort Steve. Eventually, they agree that they had to keep going, and that was the end of this tape. The broken camera was found in its case and there was an additional tape found inside with it. And that tape will be the next video. But before we get to that, let's recap. James and his friend Dave returned to the spot to pay their respects and it's been 3 years but only found himself in the same situation as he did before. While there, he stumbled across Steven who miraculously was still alive, but to him it hasn't been 3 years. Time apparently works different there. As for the masked figure, we still have no answers yet, so hopefully we do in the next one. So the next video begins by warning us that the video isn't fully fixed due to visual tears and the audio distortions. Of course, that won't stop us from watching. We get shown them all driving on the road and all of them seem silent. That is, until they got a phone call. As James picked up the phone, I believe the audio distorted. Regardless of this, the other 2 didn't hear who called, and James just said it was an unknown number and no one spoke. They returned to staying quiet, and when they reached the sign, they decided to take the turn because they have no other option. Sadly, that didn't work either and they're still in a loop. While driving, they suddenly had to hit the brakes due to the masked person peering on the road. They were at a standstill until Steve told James to drive, so he did. However, before they could hit the masked person, they suddenly appeared in front of the tunnel. Once realization hit, they all screamed as they entered, and that was the end of that one. That was a short entry, but with the next video, we get the continuation. Now, it turns out during the chaos of the last video, they crashed. Dave suggested that they could just walk, but Steve snapped back, saying that it won't work if driving didn't work. But they soon spotted a shelter of some sort. When they entered, it was well lit with candles, had writing on the walls, and there were so many masks lying around. After examining the place and taking a few masks, they decided it was best to leave. While walking, they pointed out how the writing on the walls were sentences that they said before. They were confused about how the person knew this information and suddenly they had to hide and remain quiet when they spotted the masked person nearby. What was the masked person doing? They were just standing there and suddenly a car appeared in front of the tunnel. The sight in front of us feeling oddly familiar but from a different perspective. And after hearing the screams, they realized it was them from the past. James got up and was about to walk away until Steve told him not to go, but James responded by saying they don't have a choice and put on the mask that he took from the shelter while walking away. He seems to have a goal in mind as he left. Meanwhile, the screams continued to be heard in the background, and being unable to stop James, both Steve and Dave stepped away to chat. Steve said this happened before and to stop his potential death, he plans on intervening because he believes that's what saved him before. He told Dave to stay put because he wasn't part of it and he put on the mask so he wouldn't be recognized. Steve then gave chase when he saw his past self running. Meanwhile, Dave saw someone else briefly before they walked away. The footage then cuts to night vision and the events of the first video happens but from a different perspective and with more information. Future Steve, our Steve, successfully managed to knock out his past self and drag his body away to safety, so his fate wouldn't be death. However, his past self woke up and attacked him, believing he was the masked person tormenting and killing his friends. So in the original video, it was future Steve that got murdered and not Steve from the past. His past self killed him. Dave called out to him, but past Steve and ran. When Dave turned around, the masked person appeared and the video cut. At the end, we get left with a message saying that until more footage is found, these events will be left as an unsolved mystery. And that's it. It's been a decade, so it's right to assume that that was the last video. Confusing, huh? Honestly, I tried finding other people's opinion to help me better describe what's going on, but I believe it's best that I gave my own thoughts to the best of my abilities because many people have conflicting ideas ideas of what's going on. I doubt I'll be correct, so feel free to tell me your own thoughts in the comments. Now for the events of the first video, 2 of the 4 friends died. James escaped while Steven died, but it's not Steven from that timeline that died. Steven from that timeline killed his other self with the camera before running off. 3 years passed and James with his friend Dave went to the road to pay their respects, but find themselves in the loop. In the background, we sometimes see the masked person. I'm not too confident in guessing who it is, but some believe it's James and he's keeping his other self in the loop until he eventually leads him to find Steven. Steven, after killing his other version, was found by the 2, and after the group failed to run over the masked person, they crashed. Eventually, they found a hut with masks and writing of their past conversations. They took a mask and returned to the tunnel just to be greeted with the events from the first video. James put on a mask and left. Personally, I believe James left so he could save his past self from dying. Meanwhile, Steve tried doing the same and wanted to save his past self as well from potentially getting killed, but as we all know, he ends up dying by the hands of his past self. Now, why didn't Steve realize he would end up dying because of this? Why didn't he realize trying to save his past self would just lead to a constant loop of him dying? I don't know fully myself. I think the shock of murdering someone didn't click in his mind that the person he murdered was himself. So when he planned on rescuing his past self, he didn't think back on who he murdered, so maybe he believed he actually killed the masked person without realizing it. So when he finds himself in that situation, he didn't realize he was the masked person that was going to be killed. Probably. I'm not too confident in that. Anyway, Steve's past self runs through the tunnel after murdering his future self and gets found by future James and Dave. With this, the cycle continues and repeats. Now, if I had to throw in a theory into the hat, I believe both James and Steve are clear reasons why the loop is continuing. Because James is saving himself, it leads to his other self returning to the place and finding Steven, which leads to the loop continuing. Meanwhile, because Steve is trying to save himself, it ends with him dying and his other self being found by James, making the loop constantly repeat. As for Dave, it just seems like he's stuck in all of this. That's what people believe, however, I believe he has a bigger part in this. I believe Dave became one of the masked people just like the other 2, but with the goal to kill everyone instead of saving a particular person. The reason why I believe this is because if James and Steven died along with the other 2, the loop will stop and Dave wouldn't even be caught in the situation in the first place. He only went to that place because he accompanied James to pay his respects. By killing the others, he's saving himself the trouble from being dragged into the mess. Sadly, his goal to kill everyone fails because of the other 2 intervening. But I don't know. I'm not confident. Maybe Dave just ended up dying by the hands of the masked person at the end of the last video. Maybe James is the one who's trying to stop the loop by killing them all, but I don't know, because he's also saving his past self, so I don't know. I'm only blaming Dave because I feel like he has a part in this. But again, please share your thoughts with me in the comments. And this concludes on my explore video of No Through Road, believed to be one of the first analog horror videos on YouTube, and is still an amazing one even after 14 years! It's a classic, holds up pretty well in the present day, and compared to other analog horrors, this one is far better. I'm not saying that recent analog horror series are bad. There's a lot of good ones out there, trust me, I'm finding them. But this one holds a special place in a lot of people's hearts, and it clearly deserves the popularity it receives. And for being so old, it's genuinely one of the better ones. So if you haven't watched it, shame on you. Anyways, I hope you have a good day. I better not catch you dying on me, and goodbye!